In my work with the Principal Center, part of what I do every week is this show, the Instructional Leadership Show. And we are here today for episode 48, Shifting Your Role for Higher Impact Feedback Conversations. Every week on the Instructional Leadership Show, it's our mission to help you confidently get into classrooms every day, have feedback conversations that change teacher practice, and discover your best opportunities for school improvement. Every week on the show, we follow our high-performance instructional leadership roadmap, and for the month of March, our topic is feedback conversations, developing the habit of getting into regular feedback conversations with the teachers you supervise. So if you are an instructional leader, you know that a big part of the way you exercise instructional leadership is through those conversations, one-on-one and in groups with teachers. And today we're going to talk about those one-on-one conversations where you are differentiating the role that you play in order to have the impact that you want to have as an instructional leader. So our essential question for today is, how can we shift that role, the role we play as an instructional leader, in order to best meet the needs of the teacher in that feedback conversation, in order to best change teacher practice? And I think we all default to a certain role, like we all have a certain preference. Probably most of us like to be the coach. If you are not much of a coach type person, you might like to see yourself more as the, kind of the mayor of the school or the boss. You might have just a kind of a central metaphor that guides you in kind of choosing a role. But when we stick only to the role that's most comfortable for us, we often don't have the impact that we want to have. We don't change teacher practice in the ways that we could if we were willing to differentiate. And I want to suggest to you that the best way to choose what role to play is to allow the evidence of what's going on in that particular situation to guide you. This is what I call an evidence-driven approach. Rather than allow your approach to be driven by someone else's standards or your preferences or what the teacher just seems to prefer, a lot of those preferences send us in the wrong direction. What we need to instead do is be guided by the evidence. And there are several sources of evidence in a conversation that we can use to make those decisions about how to best put on the right hat to change teacher practice. One obvious source of evidence is, of course, what we saw in our observation. Now, if you're doing a formal observation, a big, long observation, it may be the case that you have too much evidence. You might have 40 pages or 40 minutes worth of notes, pages and pages of scripting and snippets of dialogue that you wrote down, all sorts of observations. You might have tons of evidence. Or if it's a very brief observation, if you're only in the classroom for a couple of minutes, you might have just some impressions, a few notes that you've jotted down in an app or on paper, or maybe just some things, if it's short enough, that you've kept in your head. But that evidence of what took place in the classroom is hugely important grist for the conversation. It is what you actually talk about. Right? The whole purpose of getting into classrooms is that we're not just talking about teacher practice in the abstract. We're not talking about it philosophically. We're talking about what we actually saw. So this is an evidence-driven approach. But what we see in the classroom is not our only source of evidence. We also have to think about evidence of best practice. What do we know about effective teaching and learning that steers us in a particular direction? So evidence of pedagogy, best practice, the research in the field is our second source. The third source of evidence we can use to help us make these decisions about how to differentiate our role in feedback conversations is how the teacher is reacting, right? If we're trying one approach, if we're trying to get someone to be reflective and it's just kind of not working, that's important evidence for us to use in the moment to adjust our approach. So the evidence-driven mindset is a big part of what makes this work, because we're getting away from just what we're comfortable with, what the teacher prefers, what the norm is in our school, what the superintendent wants, and we're focusing on what the evidence tells us we should be doing. So we need to differentiate. We need to adjust the role that we are playing in order to avoid certain pitfalls and kind of dead ends in the feedback process. And so often we fall into these familiar scripts that, we don't even realize that we're doing it, but it just happens naturally because these are so common and so easy for us to stumble into. So I want to take you through a couple of kind of default scripts that keep us from really having the impact that we want to have as instructional leaders. The first script is what I call who's doing the work. And this is a trap that we fall into when we take too much responsibility for teacher growth. As instructional leaders, we play a crucial role in helping teachers grow, but we don't do the growth for the teacher, right? There has to be teacher involvement, there has to be teacher ownership in order for teacher practice to change. We cannot do that for people. But when we take on too much of that work ourselves and we kind of overstep our role, we do all the observing, all the note-taking, all the noticing what matters, all the deciding what matters, all of the pointing out what matters, and all of the decision-making about what needs to change. And that puts the teacher in this very passive role where basically all they have left to do is listen and smile and nod and say, okay, sounds good, I will do that. And we know that sometimes people do need some hand-holding, they do need some direction. But if we always play this one role, execute that one script of I'm the boss, I do all the work in instructional leadership interactions, we know that's not going to change teacher practice. We've got to be more flexible. We've got to have more tools in our toolbox. Another typical script that we can get trapped in is to have so much of a focus on best practice that it just becomes a game that we play where we ask questions and then we kind of solicit the correct answers from the teacher. And assuming the teacher was present for the professional development and reads the school newsletter, they know what the correct answer is. And they know that in this script, in this kind of drama that we enact sometimes, where feedback conversations are really just about giving the correct answers, that's what they do. They answer the questions that the administrator is asking correctly. They promise to make the changes to their practice that that discussion suggests, but nothing really changes. So we've got to watch out for that script as well. If you're joining us live on Facebook, Periscope, LinkedIn, YouTube, wherever you might be tuning in from, let me know, leave a comment, and let me know what you think about these typical scripts. So we're talking about the kind of pitfalls that we can find ourselves in feedback conversations when we're not differentiating our role enough based on what the situation demands. A third script that we can get trapped in is one of making false promises. Now, this is big when it comes to supporting teachers and making a change. If someone is going to try something new, but it's going to be difficult, or maybe there's a situation with a student or another staff member that's proving a little bit difficult, it's easy for us in the moment to promise to support that teacher in whatever they need. And it's easy for the teacher in the moment to promise to follow through on whatever commitment they've made to change their practice. And if we know that we're both overwhelmed, we know that this is one of just one or two walkthroughs that are going to happen for the year, or maybe this is our only formal observation, we know there's a very low likelihood of the other person ever circling back with us and saying, hey, did you do what you said you were going to do? And if that's the role that we have accepted, and that's the role that we have allowed teachers to accept for themselves, we know practice is not going to change with those false promises. A fourth script that I thought might resonate with you is one that I call the feedback sandwich. And this is one that I talk about all the time. If you've seen me in person, you know we've talked about the feedback sandwich. If you have read my book, Now We're Talking, 21 Days to High Performance Instructional Leadership, you know I'm not a big fan of the feedback sandwich, which goes like this. The administrator observes for a while and then in the feedback conversation says, hey, Justin, I noticed something good today. Hey, you got your bow tie on, looks great. Students seemed really engaged today. I have a question about, or I wonder about, or I have a suggestion. So we got the compliment first. Now we've got the criticism, the suggestion for improvement, something that needs to potentially change. And then we put in another compliment to kind of cushion the blow. So, hey, really nice job today. Just let me know what you think about that suggestion that I gave to you. So this feedback sandwich of compliment, suggestion, compliment is a comfortable structure. It puts us at ease because we like it. The problems with that format, though, are many, as I talk about in the book. It does not work very well because it kind of confuses people about, which were we the most sincere about, the compliments, the suggestion. Some people run with one and not the other, and we just don't know what's going to happen when we use the feedback sandwich. And we leave people worse off than before because they're more confused about what we thought than before we even came in. So with that feedback sandwich, we have to be really careful about really believing any promises that the teacher makes to implement what we said. Sometimes people over-implement, overreact, and don't take enough ownership for themselves, and they think they've been given a mandate. In other cases, they just kind of blow it off and don't even think about it at all. So that script is probably the most common when people think they're doing a good job. But I want to encourage you to be more flexible with yourself and more flexible with the situation so that you can give the teacher the kind of feedback and the kind of leadership that they actually need. All right, one more. The fifth script that I have identified is the be reflective script. Now, if you are a former instructional coach or a current instructional coach, or if you're an administrator who sees yourself primarily through that coaching lens, you like to wear that coaching hat, you might find it most natural and most comfortable to ask reflective questions and to say, tell me your thoughts on this, or here's a piece of evidence from my notes. Tell me about that. What do you think? What changes might you want to make? And if we're not careful, what can happen when our script is the be reflective script is that we can both kind of play this game, adopt this role of, oh yes, we're going to do this very serious reflection, oh yeah, and it kind of becomes performative, right? It kind of becomes this show that we put on of being, the teacher has to be reflective, the teacher has to look reflective, the teacher has to appreciate the opportunity to be reflective, even if they really want to get out of this conversation so they can run to the teacher's lounge and grab a cup of coffee because their kids are coming back in 3 minutes. If the purpose of the conversation is to act reflective, it's probably not going to change teacher practice. And I think that's a tough one for us because this is where the level of sincerity is probably the highest with this. Everybody's intentions look good, but we've got to ask ourselves, does this really change teacher practice? Let me know what you think on that one. Leave a comment if you're watching live. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that one because I know this might ruffle some feathers here. So there are 3 roles that we can play. You might have heard me talk about this in episode 23 of the Instructional Leadership Show, or you might have read my article, How Instructional Leaders Change Teacher Practice. I'll give you a link to that in just a little bit if you haven't seen that or if you'd like to print that off. The 3 roles that we can play in any feedback conversation are the boss, the coach, and the leader. And a big misconception that people have about these roles that I want to be very clear about is that these roles are not tied to the individual. I'm not saying you have these teachers over here who need you to always be the boss, and these teachers over here who always need you to be the leader, and these teachers in the middle who always need you to be the coach. It's not about the person. It's about the situation. And if we try to just play one role all the time with a given person, the differentiation from person to person is not really going to be the kind of differentiation we need. We need to differentiate within a single conversation. And you might actually play all 3 roles within a conversation. So before we talk too much more about what we do in each of those roles, I wanted to talk briefly about what happens when we skip one of those roles, when we avoid one of those roles because it's uncomfortable and because we don't feel like putting on that particular hat, even though that's what we know the teacher needs. When we shy back and don't play the boss, even when we need to, when we're unwilling to give a directive, sometimes we play this game where we try to draw the insight out of the teacher. We know in our minds exactly what the teacher needs to do. We really feel like saying, look, you need to do this. You need to be in the classroom before the bell, you cannot be down the hall when the bell rings. You need to be in the classroom when the bell rings. If we're having some sort of problem like that, it's clear to us we need to just state it directly. It is not going to work to just kind of coach the teacher to accepting an expectation that really just needs to be an expectation. And I think we've probably all dealt with people like that. I don't know if you're seeing this with younger teachers, as kind of the millennial generation enters the teaching, moves up through the teaching workforce, if there's more of this sense of everything should be reflective and nothing should ever be directive. But I don't know, maybe this is unpopular, but I feel like there do need to be things that we say are directive. You need to be here on time, and on time is not when the bell rings. You need to be on campus at whatever our contract time is, if not before. There are things where it's just not a coaching conversation. It is a directive, and that can be uncomfortable, right? It's uncomfortable to play the boss when we need to, but we've got to do it. Things don't get better when we shy back from playing that role. So when we try to be a coach when we really need to be the boss, we end up making suggestions about things that are not suggestions. We end up getting frustrated about people's intentions. We say, well, I just wish they want to get better. Like I want them to want to get better, or I want them to want to hold themselves to a higher standard, instead of doing what we actually can do and holding people accountable. Sometimes we just have to hold people accountable, and it does no good to wish they wanted to be better on their own. Like sometimes our job is just to say, look, I'm going to hold you accountable for being here on time, and that's pretty much the end of the conversation. It's not a reflective conversation. So sometimes that boss role is the hat we need to wear. Sometimes we need to be the coach, but maybe that coach role doesn't seem to kind of give us the authority that we need. Maybe that feels too soft. So sometimes people play the boss unnecessarily when they actually should play the coach role and give kind of a directive. Or sometimes we want to be supportive, so we make a promise like, oh yeah, I'll get you a sub for that, or I'll look up some resources for you. When that that desire to just allow the teacher to make their own decision, to find their own solutions, really was what was warranted. Or sometimes when we are talking about the evidence, talking about what we saw, we come to an insight, we want to be the source of that insight, and we know it would be more powerful for that teacher to discover that insight for themselves, and they're almost right there, but we cut it off and we say, you know what, here's what you need to do. Like when we shy back from that coach role, we really can hamper teachers' growth. Third, when we need to play the leader role, but we don't. This is one that I think we have a problem with when we get serious about feedback conversations. We forget that we have a serious obligation as administrators for providing what teachers need, for providing the support, providing the context, holding ourselves accountable for making sure that teacher working conditions are setting them up for success. And perhaps this happens more in struggling schools. If you have severe constraints on your resources, if you have a fair amount of drama going on, if you've had a lot of turnover, if you're in a district that's fairly chaotic, sometimes we ask teachers to do the impossible while ourselves failing to do the reasonable. And we can fail to do the reasonable in terms of providing support for understandable reasons. If you're extremely overwhelmed with a discipline issue, maybe there was a big fight, maybe there's some big thing going on. If that leaves teachers in a position where they don't have the basics of what they need, right? Maybe the boiler didn't get fixed and our HVAC system was offline. Maybe the supplies didn't get ordered and now people don't have what they need to do their science labs. There are all of these conditions that teachers need us to be accountable for and need us to take responsibility for so that they can focus on their piece. And we've got to take that responsibility, and we've got to listen in those feedback conversations and make sure that we are gathering information. This is the leader's role in wearing that hat in a feedback conversation is to listen for opportunities to better support teachers and to give them what they need to be successful. One further example there, I've got at the bottom of the slide here, we allow too many priorities to impinge on teachers, causing a loss of focus and coherence. I do not believe it is a positive example of instructional leadership to simply throw more and more and more at teachers and say, well, these are all best practices, so do them all. If that creates this sense of overwhelm, this sense of incoherence, this sense of just burnout, we've got to be the ones as leaders to say, wait a minute, these are all good things, but we can't do them all at once. As a leader, I'm listening in that conversation to what teachers are telling me. If they are confused about how they can make all this work, maybe we can figure some things out together, but I might also have to draw a line and say, you know what, you're right, this is too much. Let's do this part and the rest can wait. That is a courageous leadership act that we have got to be willing to take. So how can we shift the role that we play in a feedback conversation based on what we discover throughout the course of that conversation? It is going to be based, as we said, on evidence. And there are a couple of different kinds of evidence. We talked about the evidence that we gather from the observation itself, whether that's a formal or informal observation. But another kind of evidence is the teacher's response, their reaction, what's coming up in the conversation. And a fourth type of evidence that we didn't talk about before is the track record, like the pattern in terms of what is working with that teacher over time. If you know every time you play the coaching role that's giving the teacher a way to weasel out of any kind of commitment to following through, and they act very reflective in the moment, and then they don't change anything, well, then you know that maybe that coaching role is not what that teacher needs from you. So all of those sources of evidence can help you adjust. So let's take that scenario as our first example here. What if you have a teacher who is very reflective? They play the game. They take, they do the eyebrow thing where oh yeah, I take this very seriously. Thanks for your comments on this. They really have a lot of enthusiasm and ownership, and they are really fun to talk to because they love to talk about practice, and they're always reading new stuff and trying new stuff. But it's kind of like a hamster wheel of new ideas. They're churning very quickly through new ideas, and they never really let anything stick, and they're always moving on to the next thing. Well, that is someone who probably needs a little bit less of the coaching hat and a little bit more of the boss hat to say, this is great. I'm glad we're talking about this. This is exciting. But I want to make sure that the experience for students is not one of just, jumbled chaos where you're always trying new things. Like, what are you going to do this month? What are you going to do next month? Let's get a plan together here that's going to create some consistency. That teacher might need you to play, to ratchet down the coach role a little bit and to be a little bit more the boss. Maybe you're still letting them drive the bus here, but maybe you are holding them accountable to some specific commitments that they are choosing, but that they are committing to following through on and not abandoning for the next shiny object. Does that make sense? Let me know what you think about that. Let's talk about a second scenario where we need to adjust our role that we play within the feedback conversation based on what the teacher seems to need. What if we have a teacher who is just the best person, the hardest working? They want to get better. They're always willing to give 110%. They're willing to stay late. They always say yes when we need somebody to lead a committee. But the conditions that they are working under, for whatever reason, are nearly impossible. Often these are the people who always say yes when a random class needs to be taught at the secondary level. So these are the people who end up with 3 or 4 or 5 preps, and they're coaching a sport, and they're running 2 after-school activities. And it's like, how could you possibly even do that job? They're working under impossible conditions, but they're not complaining, right? This might be a situation where we need to play the leader and create the conditions that are going to set the teacher up for success and say, what? I know you are willing to coach volleyball again this year, and I appreciate that so much, and the kids love you, but let's look at what you've committed to. We've got to pick fewer of these things. So have that conversation and play the leader and be willing to help that teacher draw a line and say, you can't do all of this. We need to take some of this off your plate so that you don't burn out. All right, a third scenario I thought might resonate a bit. What if you have someone who is a big idea person? And honestly, this was probably me as a new teacher. Someone who is always excited about new ideas. They have a very open mindset, growth mindset. They're always looking for new ideas online and trying new things. But if you look at the fundamentals, the basics of, are you planning your lessons diligently? Are you assessing student work? Are you communicating with parents? Are you doing all of those things that are the hard but necessary work of being a teacher? That might be a person who needs us to play the boss role a little bit more and needs us to say, hey, it's great that you led this workshop and did all this research online and are trying all this new stuff, but hey, you also need to be on time to staff meetings. Like you can't just do one without the other. Sometimes we need to ratchet down the coaching role if the basic expectations are not being met and play that boss role. And again, I know, my friends, I know this is uncomfortable. I know it's not always what we need to do. And I know sometimes we have people who can be a little bit touchy about that. And the better the relationship we have with someone, the more we can more comfortably put on that boss hat and say, look, I know you're doing some great things, and I know this is a little bit awkward, but hey, look, you got to be here on time, that kind of thing. Okay, another scenario, just one more here. We're good on the scenarios there. So how do we adjust our role? How do we know what to do in the moment? Of course, we've said this several times now. We've talked about the different sources of evidence. We always start with the evidence of teacher practice and the evidence from within the conversation and the evidence from patterns over time about what that teacher needs. But then we focus on making it a conversation. We ask an evidence-based question. And I'll give you my evidence-based questions in just a moment. But then we do the most important part, which I've got in all caps here, and that is that we listen. We let the teacher talk, we zip it, We let the teacher talk and we just listen. When we listen, we can start to discover more evidence about what role that teacher needs us to play in the moment. The conversation can evolve and unfold, and we can go down a particular path and then realize what role we need to play. Is this person coming to a conclusion that they're definitely going to follow through on? Are they taking away what they needed to from this interaction, and are they going to actually change their practice based on it? What role do I need to play? You know at that point in the conversation, and all you have to do is play that role and follow through and do it. So to kind of summarize the 3 roles, in any feedback conversation with a teacher, we can play the boss, the coach, or the leader. The boss is one that we're usually hesitant to play because it's about giving directives, it's about changing people's behavior, and we're working with professionals who don't like to be told what to do, and most of the time don't need to, hopefully. But when they do, when those basic behavioral expectations, if somebody's yelling at kids, look, you got to tell them not to, right? You got to say, look, this is a requirement. This is not optional. This is an employment issue. You will not yell at kids if you work here. All right. So sometimes we've got to lay down the law like that. Most of the time we want to play the coach, but if our playing the coach is leading to this games playing on the teacher's part where they are just acting reflective and not really changing anything, then we've got to be willing to maybe play the boss, maybe create conditions that will lead that teacher to actually be successful. Sometimes the conditions can be pretty simple. Sometimes the condition could be, hey, I need to hook this teacher up with another colleague who can kind of keep them on track with following through on the changes that they have. And then the leader role is really all about creating the context where teachers can thrive and do their best work. Sometimes they need us to adjust the schedule. Sometimes they need us to buy them something. Sometimes they need us to get them a sub. Sometimes they need us to deal with one of their colleagues who is making it difficult for them to be successful. So those are the 3 roles. Let me know what you think. Give them a try in your next feedback conversation. Don't try to tie one role to one person and say, well, this person, I'm always going to be the coach for them, and this other person, I'm always going to be the boss. Now, you've got to be flexible. Every teacher you have is going to need you to play all 3 of these roles, and you've got to let yourself be driven by the evidence into the right role based on that situation. For more on the 3 roles, I want to refer you to our past episode number 23, 3 roles for differentiated feedback on teaching, which our Instructional Leadership Association members will find in the member dashboard. And even if you're not a member, you can find our article, principalcenter.com/3 and the word roles, ROLES. So principalcenter.com/3roles will get you a PDF version of how instructional leaders change teacher practice, where we talk about each of these roles in depth. And I said I would share my evidence-based feedback conversations with you, where you note something, you share something that you observed, that you want to talk about, that you think will lead to a rich conversation, and then you get the teacher talking. These are the 10 questions that will allow you to get the teacher talking without you controlling too much of the conversation, so that you can see where the teacher's thinking is, what they need to do next, and what role you need to play. So that is it for today. If you are interested in working together over the coming year on issues of identifying clear shared expectations, articulating those, and allowing those to guide your feedback conversations, I want to make sure you know about the Instructional Vision Project. Now, if you're listening to this later, no worries, but if you are listening to this before March 19th, 2020, we have an enrollment deadline if you're interested in being part of the Instructional Vision Project. What I'm going to be doing in that project is working with a number of schools. We have schools in all kinds of different contexts, all different sizes and levels. Really interesting group of schools that I'm working with. And I'm looking for case studies for my next book. Case studies specifically about instructional leaders and schools that are defining shared expectations in the form of rubrics for practice. That could be a teacher evaluation rubric. That could be something related to scope and sequence of curriculum. It could be school-wide instructional strategies. It could be school-wide expectations for students. Some anchor of practice that is creating a common expectation, a common language, a common vocabulary, articulating that, and then moving staff toward that. That's what we're doing in the Instructional Vision Project, which is open exclusively to our Navigator members through March 19th. So if you are a Navigator member, please let me know ASAP so that we can talk about a timeline for working together. We don't have to start right away, but I do need to know by March 19th if you're interested in working with me on that, so I can kind of get the set of schools identified that I will be working with. This is either entirely online or at least mostly online. There are a few schools locally within my area that I think I'll be working with in person a little bit. But this is open to people anywhere in the world. If you are a Navigator school, you are eligible to participate. If you are interested in an individual membership, maybe you are seeking an admin job right now, or maybe you are in one job now, but you might be transitioning to a new job in another organization or a different role. We also have an individual Navigator membership that travels with you. And if you're interested in a site license quote to become a Navigator school, you can get that at principalcenter.com/navigator. Just whatever you do that soon, because registration closes March 19th. And if you are a superintendent, charter CEO, head of school for an independent school, and you're interested in bringing some of the approaches that we've talked about to your entire organization, I want to let you know about the Instructional Leadership Directors Roundtable, which is our program for senior leaders. And it includes everything in Navigator, so it's largely the same set of resources for your team, but we also provide one-on-one consulting support for your big picture leadership decisions. And we also gather once a month with an industry thought leader so that you can ask questions directly and gain access to their expertise. And tomorrow we are being joined by Dr. Barbara Blackburn, who is an expert on rigor, probably the number one author in our profession on instructional rigor. She's written over 24 books last time I counted, and I have to recheck often because she's always coming up with new ways to apply rigor and differentiation, and just a tremendous expert and resource on rigor. So if you're part of the roundtable, you should have an email from me on that, and check your email from yesterday. I'll send another one with a reminder. And if you're not part of that, let me know. I'd be happy to have you tune in just to kind of see what that's like. So thanks so much for being here. This has been episode 48 of the Instructional Leadership Show. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Justin Bader, and I will see you next time. Take care.